In this lecture, we'll be taking another look at kinship and descent, and specifically highlight systems of descent as political systems of control. We'll begin with the smallest of our units, in this case, the personal kindred. A personal kindred is an individual's circle of relatives. It includes the relationships that hold the kindred together. These are calculated or reckoned from an individual's point of view, in this case, the ego, the person constructing or retelling what this kindred is. The most ancient reckoning of a personal kindred is based or rooted in human biology, in this case, the recognition of breeding couples and their offsprings. We've talked about this in relation to the concept of kinship. Anthropologists today have come up with a symbol system to help them quickly and very easily reconstruct an individual's personal kindred. So they're conducting a cultural interview and they're utilizing the symbols that are described and identified in your course text to literally map out the personal kindred of the person that they're talking to. How a person recalls or describes their personal kindred is based on his or her social experiences with their close blood and marriage relatives. In the previous lecture, we talked about blood relatives as being also recognized as consanguineal relatives, and as relatives who are identified through marriage ties, we recognized affinal relatives. So make sure in your notes that you have a distinction between consanguineal and affinal. As you can imagine, understanding how anthropologists describe and reconstruct culture, we can't stay with just one individual and their own personal kindred. We have to expand these relationships and extend them over both time and space. When relationship ties are extended over generations and throughout a cultural history, they become part of a descent-organized social corporation or a system of descent. This is another way of segregating kinship, the concept of kinship, from the concept of descent. Many anthropologists today recognize descent-based social corporations to be the earliest expressions of human political concepts such as social control. So the family, how it was organized, how it was reckoned in a sense or calculated by the people inside of a household or a community, really became the building block for eventually political control. In summary, let's take a look at 4 significant differences that separate out the concept of kinship from the concept of a descent system or a descent-based social corporation. Number 1, under kinship. Kinship is defined with reference to an individual, an ego, or a pair of individuals. Whereas, under descent, descent is understood in reference to an ancestor or an ancestress. It has a history to it. Number 2, kinship, because it is so simple in nature and really rooted in human biology, is universal. In contrast, descent or a descent system is culturally recognized, and it is culturally recognized specific to a society or to a region. Third, under kinship, we recognize this concept or the concept of kinship to be normally bilateral. So as you build your personal kindred, you take a look at blood and marriage relationships on your mother's side and your father's side. all in relation to you, the ego. This differs from a system of descent, which in a sense highlights connections only through a limited class of people or of relatives. For example, a patriclan or a clan, and we talked about clans when we were looking at Polynesian culture. A patriclan organizes a wide variety of communities and the households within them according to the blood ties of men over successive generations. These historical blood ties, associated again with men, are then moved laterally according to marriage relationships and the offspring that come from those marriages. That is a very simplified way of describing a patriclan from this perspective of being a descent system. Now think about how it might act politically to incorporate people into almost a single political unit. Well, now we have a fourth and final contrast between kinship and descent. So the fourth concept. Kinship relationships are relative. You are a son or a nephew only in relation to some other particular person. So they are relative to how, in this case, the ego is calculating his or her relationship to others. Whereas descent and descent statuses are, in a sense, absolute. You are or are not a member of a particular descent group. Take a moment, if you need to go back over these four main concepts and create maybe two columns of information, one under kinship and one under descent, in your lecture notes. In a moment, I'll turn to why descent and systems of descent became historically important to human civilization and its development and its spread over the entire globe. Systems of descent were very important to early food producers, especially those who are appearing in the mid-latitudes and the equatorial regions of the planet right around 10,000 years ago. As populations increased, members of communities who were cultivating foods and producing surpluses searched for cultural systems that could organize potential laborers in a very peaceful manner. Systems of descent were the answer. Early civilizations investing a significant amount of land, labor, and capital into food production and into social control were able to answer some of the following questions by incorporating or building off of descent systems that were already in place. They addressed how stable local groups could be formed in a very rapid manner, and in a sense, how these particular groups could act independently of one another as political units. Another question that was answered is how the relationship of people to the land was defined in a legal sense. A third question: how would the relationships of people to the land and other resources be maintained across many generations? A fourth question: how would an individual have rights and develop alliances to other groups? And fifth and finally, another question important to these early civilizations is how will political relationships between local groups be maintained without a centralized government? Again, systems of descent and these descent-based social corporations seem to be the answer. When we look at the archaeology of the American Southwest, when we look at the archaeology of Mesoamerica and South America, when we look at the archaeology of the Old World, places like the Fertile Crescent, we see material evidence for these social corporations and the political systems which seem to benefit from their presence. Let's take a closer look now through an anthropological lens at this solution. Early human political structures were built on this idea of descent order, the idea that there was a structure in place that could be utilized in order to organize people and to control things like labor. In these descent orders, individual relationships were not emphasized, but relationships across many generations and across a great deal of space were emphasized in relation to, say, an ancestor or a creation myth. These descent orders and the cultural history that they were a part of were further organized according to descent rules. And I have three culturally recognized descent rule systems that are very common when we take a look at the history of the planet and, of course, the history of humankind. The first descent rule system I'd like to highlight, and one that I've already mentioned in a previous lecture, is referred to as a patrilineal descent system or an agnatic descent system. This is one in which we have an ancestor that is commonly recognized across both time and space, and then a series of male blood ties eventually tracing living people back to that ancestor. So a line of blood relatives that are all male. It's a patrilineal descent rule or an agnatic descent rule that binds together a social corporation. In a similar fashion, we have matrilineal descent rules or uterine descent rules. This is where descent from an ancestress is recognized through a series of blood-related females. And then finally, we have a cognatic descent rule system. This is where you have either a ancestor or an ancestress, so a male or female ancestor who ties together or binds together a wide variety of both men and women who are consanguineal relatives or relatives who are tied together through their blood ties. And then there's a combination of variation that can occur within this structure, sometimes asexual or even transgender. So the cognatic descent system of rules allows a variety of descent strategies that will then bind together a corporation, a social corporation, or a larger descent order. The blood and eventually marriage ties that becomes a kind of skeletal framework for a cognatic descent order that is governed in a sense by cognatic descent rules really allows a little bit of freedom in terms of how living individuals trace their heritage to a ancestor or ancestress. Unilineal descent rules, then, are really important for a variety of reasons. First of all, there is always some mechanism for binding a number of individuals from across a region over time together. And then there is this kind of political and economic component to these descent systems, especially those that are organized according to a unilineal pattern of blood recognition and blood ties. In this case, redistributing, in this case, let's say labor or resources such as land or even resources of wealth. This would fall under capital. Strict unilineal descent systems, however, are a little bit different from that third category of descent rules that I described for you there, that cognatic descent rule category. Sometimes anthropologists refer to this kind of catch-all category as a kind of cognatic stock. This is where there's both a unilineal and a non-unilineal combination of relationships that kind of lump together a variety of people, again, from a wide geographical region and from a pretty extensive history. However, these systems of order are established and how they are calculated and recognized both at the individual level, also the group level, and at the community level, one of the things we have to really emphasize in this case is that they are culturally embedded systems for regulating resources. I think one of the best examples that is often discussed in anthropological circles relates to the Talensi people of modern Ghana. The Talensi utilize a system of magic for wielding, in this case, positive power, and a system of witchcraft. And again, witchcraft is a little bit different from magic in the sense that witchcraft is often associated with some sort of third party and results in what is more often than not recognized as a kind of a negative byproduct. The Talensi in this case utilize their system of descent, one that is organized according to a series of matrilineal descent rules, to identify the mode or the path that magic flows from one generation to the next. So in the Talensi example, and again, they are an agrarian society, women, the blood of women, becomes the backbone for positive magical power that can be shared from one generation to the next, ensuring things such as the fertility of both people and their crops.